You're listening to This Motorcycle Life, conversations about why we ride. Episode 32, The Skillful Monk. I'm Bruce Philp, and thank you for listening. Motorcyclists often compare riding to meditation, but are they really even close to the same thing? That was the question posed by a listener after my conversation with sport rider Anna Rigby earlier this fall, and you're about to meet someone with an authoritative answer. The good news is that answer is yes. The even better news is that means there's even more in it for us than we ever imagined. We'll get to that fascinating conversation in just a moment. But first, as always, this. Thanks to everyone who's written me over the last few weeks, and to a couple of people who wrote reviews for the show on Apple Podcasts, something I should probably be paying more attention to. A special thanks to listener Leon from Melbourne, Australia. I'll explain that in a minute. And two other pieces of housekeeping. Welcome to listeners joining me on Amazon's new podcasting platform. I was thrilled to be part of Amazon's initial podcast offering, which all of you made possible. So thanks to you too. And if you reached out to say hi on Instagram and haven't heard back, there seems to be some kind of glitch there that's delaying me seeing your messages, sometimes for months. So please don't think I'm a jerk. I'll reply as soon as I see each one. And finally, most listeners are likely going to hear this episode during the month of November, which you probably know is pretty important to the folks at the Movember Foundation. If there was ever a time to show me that you appreciate the time and money I put into this podcast, this month and this difficult year would be it. Please donate what you can by clicking on the mustache in my show notes or in my newsletter. It would mean a lot to me, and they need you now more than ever. Okay, let's go. Well, my proudest moment as a rider this season wasn't one that I've shared with anybody before now because it started with a stupid mistake. Well, basically, I got sloppy and entered a blind corner on a tree-lined road a little bit too early, which resulted in me exiting a bit wide and hugging the center line, only to come face to face with a dump truck coming the other way with two wheels on my side of that line. Well, as I say, it was a dumb mistake, but I was still kind of proud of getting out of it. All of a sudden, I was right there in the moment. Everything stopped. I could see the whole world in photographic detail, and it seemed like I had hours to target the gap between the truck and the trees, adjust my line, and avoid disaster. Well, it was kind of embarrassing, but I figured the good news was that I was at least capable of being present. And I realize it's not a very impressive story, but that day was, for some reason, the first thing that came to mind when I received an email from an Australian listener named Leon. He'd noticed how often on this show people compare riding to meditation, two things that he does passionately and thinks might actually have a lot in common. I'm just wondering, he wrote, if you think there's room on your radar for an episode about how motorcycling and meditation intertwine. Well, I thought that sounded like a fine idea, especially given my newfound appreciation for being fully present when I'm riding, and so began a search that led to the person you're about to meet. Venerable Kusala Bhikshu is a Buddhist monk who spent more than 20 years navigating the streets and highways of Southern California on a Suzuki Volusia cruiser. Today, he lives and works at the International Buddhist Meditation Center in LA's Koreatown, so his qualifications are impeccable, and he very kindly agreed to take up Leon's challenge with me. Well, as you'll see, it turns out a blind corner isn't the only thing I underestimated this season. Presence of mind is just the beginning of what motorcycling and meditation have in common. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I reached Kusala Bhikshu at the International Buddhist Meditation Center in Los Angeles, California. Reverend Kusala, thank you for speaking with me. Good morning. How are you today?
I'm well, Bruce. Thank you.
Good. Well, so am I. It sounds like we're both getting some much needed rain in your case, and just rain in our case. So listeners may hear that in the background here, but perhaps it'll lend something to the mood. Look, before we get started, I want to acknowledge something. I am very conscious of the fact that we're going to be talking about parallels between an ancient spiritual practice and riding motorcycles, which is, kind of absurd. So I appreciate your tolerance. And I don't want the premise of our conversation to seem in any way exploitive or disrespectful. So I hope you'll help me out if I say something dumb, because I really appreciate you speaking with me.
Well, thanks, Bruce. Yeah, I don't think anything dumb can be said about this. It's an interesting parallel, and they, at some level, have a lot in common.
Well, it seems so to me, and I think that's probably what we're going to spend most of our time talking about. But maybe before we do that, it's a bit of a ritual, I guess, not surprisingly, a bit of a ritual on this show to introduce guests by asking them how they came to be motorcyclists. So why don't we start there? How did bikes come into your life, and what kind of role do they play?
Okay, well, my motorcycle history is, as a freshman in high school, my mother bought me a Honda 50 for my birthday. And this was back in the 60s, early 60s. And so it was how I started. But even before that, I used to use a clip and put a playing card on the back wheel of my bicycle. So it would make a motorcycle sound.
Right.
And it got me thinking about, wouldn't it be nice not to have to pedal? And then as a freshman in high school, I got the Honda 50, but I only had it for like 6 or 7 months because I started to skip school and just go riding. And my mom took it away and resold it. So that was a lesson learned. Don't have too much fun while you're in school. You need to follow your studies. And then in the I think it was probably the 1980s. I was between cars, and I was working in retail. I didn't have a whole lot of money saved up, and I was thinking about, well, what can I do to not take the bus? So I'm taking the bus in Culver City to Century City, and I looked out the window of the bus, and there was a guy on a motorcycle. And I thought to myself, you know what, that might be a nice alternative to the bus. And it might be cost effective to go check out some motorcycles. So I went to Marina Suzuki and found a Kawasaki Eliminator 250cc. And it was like $1,200 or something. And I had enough credit on my charge card that I could charge it. So I charged that motorcycle, and that was the beginning. And for 7 years, a motorcycle was my only form of transportation. I eventually put enough money together to get a car as well. And so I rode for 20 plus years and just had a marvelous time and learned a whole lot about what it meant to be connected to the world on a motorcycle. And I think it also made me a better car driver as well. I was more aware of things and could see road hazards better. And so that's pretty much the story. Now, then in a couple years ago, I'm 71 now. So a couple years ago, I decided it was time to let the motorcycle go. It was becoming less and less comfortable, and I was a lot stiffer than I used to be. And so I donated the motorcycle to National Public Radio, and they sold it and made some money. And I have 20 plus years of wonderful memories to look back on. Now, I have to say, in those 20 plus years, I never had an accident. I was very fortunate. My view on it was that ultimately everybody is going to get into an accident, but not necessarily in this lifetime. So that's my story.
That's great. It actually raises a question that I had planned to ask you, which was this. You gave a wonderful talk, which I found on YouTube, about your path to Buddhism. And the arc of your story, as you told it, was motivated by the fear of death. And so we then find you riding a motorcycle in Los Angeles, which strikes me as being, possibly conflicting. And I'm just wondering how that transformation happened, or did those two things not intersect until later?
Yeah, in all the time I rode my motorcycle, I never felt that I was going to die. It never entered my mind. I felt that I was aware enough and agile enough and could deal with any, problems that came up. But as I got older, in my 60s and then turning into my 70s, that feeling wasn't quite as strong. And if you've ever driven in Los Angeles, there are a lot of crazy drivers here. And not all of them respect or even see a motorcyclist. So I just thought, it was time. But I never really felt that I was going to get into an accident and that I was going to die. If I'd ever felt that way for any length of time, I wouldn't ride a motorcycle. I know some people are afraid of motorcycles and will never get on one. And other people are a little too casual with motorcycles and oftentimes find themselves in precarious situations. But I was just sort of mindful, and in a lot of cases, it was simply transportation. It wasn't just to go cruising and stuff. And
right.
So death can be a real incentive to stay awake.
Yes, yeah, that's on a motorcycle in Los Angeles is a great place to learn about mindfulness. It seems to me. So this episode, which was made possible by you kindly responding to my email, was sparked by a question from a listener, and it feels like maybe that's a good place to kind of get into the meat of this. And although I imagine we'll venture far beyond that. So this listener, his name was Leon, wrote me observing that guests on this show often compare motorcycle riding to meditation. And, he may have meant that in terms of the effect it has on us, or he may have meant it in terms of the process. I wouldn't want to presume to put his thoughts into words, but I wonder if we could start by asking you to define meditation for us and maybe explain what it's really for, or what it's really for in your practice. When you think about meditation, what are you thinking about?
Well, that's a great question. And what are you thinking about is the perfect way to enter into meditation, because the answer to that is nothing. But how do you get to think about nothing? That's the hard part. So in Buddhism, there are two forms of meditation. There's mindfulness, which is called vipassana, and there's concentration or focus meditation, which is called samatha. And so we have one leads to tranquility and focus, and one leads to awareness and mindfulness. I have found that both are useful, and what you're sort of doing is going between one or the other when you're riding a motorcycle. I felt oftentimes that I was in a cocoon of awareness, that once I sat down on the motorcycle and felt that familiar feeling of shifting into gear and pulling in the clutch and all that kind of stuff, I immediately sort of transformed my consciousness from before motorcycle to on motorcycle. And what that allowed me to do is really see things that I didn't observe while I wasn't on the motorcycle. And also to be aware of sounds and sensation in a very unique and focused way. Anybody who rides a motorcycle becomes aware of the sound of their motorcycle and can oftentimes tell if something's wrong simply by the sound that the motorcycle is making. Also, you are oftentimes aren't aware of just your intellect speaking to you, your mind, your monkey mind. That sort of slows down. And oftentimes I found no thought was part of the motorcycle experience. It also, the drone of the motorcycle engine sort of cut through all those thoughts that I had. It was like a knife cutting the thoughts into many pieces. And so none of them really formed in any special way. So I was just the sound and the sensation of wind and the feeling of the motorcycle beneath me and the eyes right at the horizon to slow the speed of the motorcycle down so I could react and respond in a skillful way. The motorcycle allows you to focus and simply be with what's happening right now. There's not too much past and there's not too much future. At least I found that to be the case when I was riding my motorcycle. And it brings bliss and happiness. There's a certain sense of joy that comes out of that, to just simply be in the present moment experience of your life, especially if it's on a motorcycle. I can't think of anything better or more sublime than that.
Yeah, that's beautifully put, and I agree. And I guess the quote I'm about to read you won't surprise you. Then this is again from listener Leon, and he said, "I've always felt that meditation has engaged the underlying philosophical aspect of motorcycling that engages me, and that also motorcycle has really enhanced my meditation practice. It's a two-way street." Do you think he's onto something there? As a rider, was that your experience?
I think he's onto something, but I wouldn't use the word intellectual understanding. I think what happens when you hit the motorcycle is the intellect turns off and the intuitive turns on. So it really shifts your consciousness from relative to ultimate, if you will. That you no longer exist in the way you did with that sense of self and being well defined. That the sense of self merges into the motorcycle and the experience. So I found that my intellect was absolutely useless, but my intuition was increased dramatically. And that enabled me to sense and feel certain things before the thought process occurred. And that was a wonderful experience. And in meditation, if you sit long enough, everything settles. The mind settles. All the thoughts settle. You settle. The sense of self merges back into the universe. And there's no well-defined feeling of who you are. At that point, you simply become everything. And I found on the motorcycle, I oftentimes felt like I was everything and interconnected and interdependent.
Mm-hmm. So he says that has a philosophical outcome for him. And so I think I hear you saying that your experience of being on a bike and the way that it kind of parallels meditation is that you are in the here and now and you're not anywhere else and you're not anything else. And I think I understand that as well as a layperson can understand it. He seems to feel there's some philosophical residue of this, and I wonder, is that also part of the package, or is that just the experience that he's having?
I think that is part of the package. I think what he's feeling is this. In Zen, they have a wonderful saying called, the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. So when we have a philosophical, intellectual understanding or perspective, that's simply the finger pointing at the experience, but it's not the experience. And I found that when I rode the motorcycle, it was more about the experience than the finger pointing at it.
That's wonderful. I'm going to try not to say that's wonderful too often, but I have a feeling I'm going to be taking some notes when I'm editing this. Just thinking a bit more about his two-way street comment, I'm just going to sort of press on this parallel some more. In a lot of the conversations I've had with people on this show, motorcycling has often ended up being a kind of metaphor for them. The sample is somewhat contaminated by the fact that a lot of people who've been on this show have personal stories that are remarkable. So naturally their experience might be more intense, but, maybe not. But it's almost like this is why people find riding healing. And it's almost like a ride is this parallel miniature life in which you have, sort of clear agency and clear responsibility for yourself. I'm not really sure what I'm asking here, but does that does to me sort of sound meditative. What do you think about that? Are we in some small, secular way moving towards enlightenment out there?
Well, perhaps, absolutely. My definition of enlightenment is the direct experience of the interconnectedness and interdependence of all phenomena, that you are no longer separate. You have become one, if you like that term, or you have become connected and unified, if you prefer that term. And I think motorcycle riding is, in a very condensed way, life. I found when I was 52, I rode to Wisconsin and back. So it was a 5,000 mile journey, and I didn't have a cell phone, and I wanted to see if I could do it. And I wanted to see how it would feel to be on the road for 7 days and then 7 days back. And would I, exist? Would I be, flexible enough to meet all of the circumstances in a skillful and happy way? And what I came to understand was again, a very Buddhist in nature, that there are the three aspects of Buddhist wisdom are impermanence, a not self, and suffering. So number one, in the impermanence of the motorcycle ride, that everything is shifting so quickly, that, the asphalt beneath your feet is almost hard to comprehend because it's so blurry from the speed. The idea of who's riding the motorcycle, or is the motorcycle simply directing itself? And then the last aspect is the suffering. That I found 6-7 hours in the saddle in one day is a lot of suffering. Joyful too, but a lot of suffering. And I found my body just needed to take a break once in a while. Being 52, I didn't have that youthful enthusiasm that I used to have before. And in stopping, it was like rest. And where am I now? How far have I gone? Where am I going? Because those thoughts didn't arise when I was riding the motorcycle. So I was surprised at how much suffering. I remember driving through Iowa, and it rained all day. It rained all day, and I have not found a way to stay dry on a motorcycle in the rain after 5 or 6 hours, no matter how many layers you have. And so I pulled into a motel for the night, and I said, "Do you guys have a washer and dryer that I can use?" "Oh yeah, it's right around the corner, sir." And I said, So you dry everything out, and you get back on the bike the next day, and off you go. And that's sort of like life, that some days are pretty rainy and cold and severe, and other days are warm and sunny and bright. And it happens, in days and months. And on a motorcycle, it happens in hours and days. It's much more concentrated. And there's a lot of learning, to be experienced on the motorcycle. And it always taught me lessons about my life after the motorcycle. What, how, why, don't get too attached. Everything changes. And ultimately there's no one living your life. It's life living itself. And, so it was, I learned a lot.
That's interesting. I assume you were very involved by that point in the practice of Buddhism. Did you experience that learning as sort of proof of concept, or were there actual revelations involved in the ride? I'm going to ask you some more questions about that ride in a minute, but I just want to grab the moment to ask about that.
Yeah. I was very involved in Buddhism. I'd been ordained by that time and was a monk. And I was visiting the family who lived in Wisconsin. And so what Buddhism always worked out for me, it either worked one or two ways. The first way was I'd read something in a book and I go, wow, that's really cool. But at that point, it's just intellectual. You have no experience, and you just wonder if it's ever going to happen to you. And then oftentimes in certain situations like motorcycles or meditation, something similar happens. Not the same thing, because I've got different karma than the person that wrote the book or wrote the article, but something similar happens, and it validates that truth that you found in the book on the pages. And you go, okay, yeah, cool, I got it now. That does work that way to a certain extent because I've experienced it. And then the second way it works for me is that I have an experience, and it's something I can't explain. I remember one time I was meditating, and I had this really unusual experience. And the next week I went to my meditation teacher and I said, I had this experience and I was wondering if you could help me out and tell me what it was. And so I explained what the feeling was and what happened and blah, blah, blah. And he looked at me and said, progress. But he didn't tell me what it was. He didn't tell me why it happened. He didn't tell me if it was good or bad. He just said progress. So sometimes you have the experience and then you're able to dissect that experience and give it meaning by a page or a person or a conversation or something. So either way, it validates it. So you've got the experience first, and that's validated by what you've read or heard. And then you have something that you've read or heard, and then that's validated by the experience. And so on that motorcycle ride, it worked both ways. Certain things happened that I went, aha, yeah. And other things happened. I said to myself, I wonder what that is, or what that means. Is there a meaning to it? Is this a sign of some sort? And so and that happens every day and every week and every year. It happens if you start to wake up and start to see the world in a rather unique way. And I see it in a rather Buddhist way, which is unique. But there's the Christian way, and there's the Islamic way, and there's the Jewish way, and all these different ways of looking at it, and they all make sense at some level, but I think it's validated by personal experience.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I've always had this feeling that there are a lot of people who ride motorcycles that are kind of questing for something, and maybe you've just explained what that is. I want to ask you about one theme that came up in some of the talks of yours that I've watched. It caught my attention. And I realized that this is a large and not simple concept, and I'm going to make it seem simpler and smaller than it really is, but it caught my attention. And when it went like this, it was the idea that the universe has no will and doesn't really care about me in particular, that it has no plan and nothing is personal. And that all there is the way I react to the things across my path, or at least that's kind of how I consumed it. So as a motorcyclist, that took me straight to the very literal challenge of surviving in traffic or hostile riding conditions. And, so I kind of chewed on that and continue to chew on that. And I wonder if there's something, the people listening to this can literally borrow from the Buddhist tradition to make us better at this, because it really does sound like the best description of life on the road that I've ever heard.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And how that idea came up to me was this, that Buddhism is non-theistic. So we don't deny a supreme being, but we say, the supreme being may not be able to help me end my suffering. And so Buddhism has this little niche. It says, we can help you with your suffering. We can show you why you suffer, and we can show you how to reduce that suffering. So what I started to see was Buddhism doesn't have justice. It doesn't have a supreme being who defines what is right and what is wrong. And what Buddhism has instead is karma, the law of cause and consequence. So when you look at the world, it's much easier to depersonalize it that way. And say, okay, this isn't really against me at all. These are certain conditions that have come together to create this situation, and I'm in it. And so, what do I need to do to make the situation better, or to end the situation altogether? And so we don't curse, and say, why me? Why me? We say, okay, what next? What do I do now? And the skill that comes from riding a motorcycle is very useful in all forms of life. And so I found, heavy traffic. Okay, I've been on the freeway, and somebody has moved over to my lane and pushed me to the center line because they didn't see me for some reason. And I'm going, wow. I guess I am invisible. I guess I don't count. I guess there is not a self to really identify. And so I just would slow down and then go back into the lane and understood that car people are looking for cars and truck people are looking for cars, but very few people are looking for motorcycles. And that's why oftentimes we're unseen and sort of stealthy as we do our journey. So in all of that, I found it karma being the concept of cause and consequence being very useful, that if I have skill in what I think, say, and do, then the consequences will be much better for me. If I am unskillful in what I think, say, and do, then the consequences will come and bite me. And so I just felt that the secret to good motorcycle riding is to be skillful in the karmic way.
Can you explain that this word skillful a little more? Because I think the people who listen to this podcast are going to understand that word a certain way, as I would. But it has a really interesting and particular meaning for you, right?
Yeah. Well, the meaning for me was, oftentimes in life, you feel that it's against you, that it's fighting you all the way, like a riding a bicycle with a strong headwind. You go, man, or going uphill on a bicycle and you go, man, this is so difficult and blah, blah, blah. And why can't it just be the way I think it should be? So oftentimes I found myself looking at the world and wondering why it's not the way it should be. And it caused me a lot of grief. If only the world was this way, if only people thought that way, this would be such a pleasant place to live. And motorcycle riding, if it wasn't too cold and it wasn't too hot and there was enough shade, or, it was an open road, it would be just like the perfect ride. And rarely does the perfect ride ever happen. There's always something that just sort of makes it less than perfect. So I thought to myself, well, okay, I'm really in charge of how I experience the world. The world just is the way it is, and I interpret it in a certain way because of, birth and school and experience and peer groups and on and on and on. And so if I really want to have a perfect ride, I don't need to change anything on the outside. I need to change something on the inside. I need to see it differently. And that's where the idea of karma came in, that if I'm practicing on being more skillful, what can I learn on this ride that I didn't know on the last ride? I can apply that and I can make the internal experience much more pleasant, no matter what the external experience is, because I become in charge. I'm in charge of the way I experience that motorcycle ride.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, for me, the parallel between motorcycle riding and meditation was interesting, and it's the reason we're speaking today. But the more I listened to you in advance of this conversation, the more I understood that the real parallel was the idea that a good motorcyclist understands that much more depends on them than sometimes seems to be the case, if that makes sense. And that really resonated for me. Would that be a fair takeaway, do you think?
That would be a very fair takeaway. That, there is an accountability that the motorcycle rider has. They are accountable. And I often thought, though I've never had an accident on a motorcycle, I've never even laid it down in 20 plus years, any accident on a motorcycle hurts. It hurts a lot. Right. So there's an accountability that says, you don't want to go there. You don't want to be in that accident. And the best way to prevent the accident is to be aware of your surroundings, because other people aren't necessarily going to be aware of you. You need to be aware of them.
Yep. That's the way I got it, and I think it's somehow validating that it seems to be a universal truth. Let's talk about your ride to Wisconsin for a minute. So you almost 20 years ago undertook a ride from Los Angeles to Wisconsin, which I gather was your birthplace or where you grew up, 5,000 miles in a couple of weeks, which you did on your own, and it seemed to leave a strong impression on you. And I read your account of that trip online, and I want to ask you about a few things you wrote about the trip afterwards and see how they sound to you 20 years later, kind of a little bit abstracted from the experience, if that's okay, because there was just some great stuff here. Let me start with this, which is the longest passage. You wrote, ellipsis, it just can't get any better than this, and yet it always did. The colors, smells, and sounds moved me not to think, but to that place deep inside where words have no meaning, where time comes to a complete stop and space is forever, the place where all things are connected and fear can't exist because you are no longer separate. And I thought that was sort of gorgeous prose. And a really beautiful passage. And I think that as I clumsily read through it, there are probably a few thousand motorcyclists out there nodding, at your words as they listen to this. It feels like a very familiar truth. Can you talk about it a bit? Is what you were experiencing there kind of spiritual, and is it therefore for us too?
Well, yeah, I think spiritual might be a better word than religious. You're right. There's something about the spirit and the spirit of writing. And what I came to realize on the road, and this was I think in New Mexico where I had that feeling, and that's where the words came from. And the road was parallel to a train track, and there was an amazingly long train to my right as I rode down this 2-lane highway. And it had just rained, and so the sage brush and the grass, and you could smell the smells were just so powerful, and you surely don't get that in a car with the windows rolled up and the air conditioner on. And it was and then the clouds were breaking and the sun was coming out, what caught me was that the fear of the ride, of going to Wisconsin, of crashing on the side of the road, all left, because in order to be fearful, I needed to be separate from the experience. And I was drawn into that experience. I was sucked in, and it just, it wouldn't let me go. It was just, you're part of us now. Our arms are open. We're going to give you a big hug and welcome back to the universe, not the world, but to the universe that you've been separate from ever since you learned how to read and write. And it just really caught me that was an amazing moment in an amazing place that would never have happened if I hadn't been on two wheels going down the highway.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that the thing that will be most familiar to people's ears. But if our listeners will indulge me just a moment of personal reflection on that. I read the sentence, the place where all things are connected and fear can't exist because you're no longer separate, and thought about my own kind of procrastination about taking a long motorcycle trip, which is driven not so much by fear, but by the feeling that when I'm on the road by myself, I feel unmoored. And it sounds to me like you've described the same experience, but in a more open and positive way. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, yeah, the idea that we've been separate since we learned to read and write, that we got a name from our parents, we were taught how to read and basic math maybe at home before kindergarten, and then we went to kindergarten and we were started to be formed into the person we were about to become. And then we went to grade school and we were even more well-defined. And then we went to high school, and some went to college and even more well-defined. And then you got a career, and you had to be this person, you had to be that person, you had to think a certain way. And if you thought the right way at the right time, you were successful and you had plenty of money, and maybe you wanted to have a family and raise your own little children into becoming somebody. And then you're on the road, and all those reference points that define you are now taken away. And all of a sudden the universe opens up again in a similar way that you were able to experience before you could think about it. That when you were just a small little guy or gal, it was just, your life was just sensation. The thought process really hadn't started yet. And then for some reason, at some point, the ego came in. And when the ego starts, which we're the only animals that have one like we do, it's such a strong one, then we have to be somebody. And Ram Dass, one of my favorite teachers, oftentimes said, when we're young, our job is to become somebody. And when we get older, our job is to become nobody. And what I found on the motorcycle ride to Wisconsin is there were many times that I was nobody. And it was a wonderful sensation that freed me from all the things I had to be or should be. But then I'd, stop off at a gas station because I needed to fill the tank. And then I needed to be somebody. I needed to leave that nobody behind and become the somebody who was riding the motorcycle, to make the payment, to use the charge card, to be somebody that the person at the gas station could relate to, that here's somebody riding a motorcycle who needs some gas. And I needed to play that part now. But then back on the open road, that somebody fell away again. And then I was nobody in the best sense of the word, that I was simply the motorcycle at that point on the road.
Wow. Thank you. That was great. That was a great answer. And it sort of leads to the next passage I wanted to ask you about, actually, which sort of screamed off the page at me, and it's this one. You wrote, the discomfort I felt on the road was my first real sign of freedom. What did that mean to you?
That is a good quote. I like that. I don't know why I said that, but yeah, the suffering on the road allows you to be free from striving towards the pleasure and happiness that we all strive for every day, every moment of our life. We try to, push away the bad, cling to the good, hold on to the good, hold on to the pleasant. And there I was on the road, and there was no pleasant. There was no pleasure. There was no good. There was simply suffering. The vibrations were painful. The wind noise was painful. The upright position was painful. All that stuff. And that sort of freed me from having to feel good. If I could accept that and just be with that without suffering, without that pain turning into suffering and that pain simply turning into sensation, then I would be free. So I'm going to be free from aversion, and I'm going to be free from attachment. And in the Buddhist meditation, there comes a time when you're sitting quietly and your knees hurt, and all of a sudden they really hurt. And all of a sudden you realize that if you don't move your leg, you'll never be able to walk again. And that's how the mind works. The mind looks at any pain as being a symptom of death. And if the pain gets strong enough, you will die. And so you're never really free from the fear of death, because pain is everywhere, saying it's just around the corner if you don't do something. So we're always adjusting the leg or adjusting our thoughts or trying to find a new experience that doesn't have the pain and suffering. But settling into that suffering was, in a very real way, practicing to be free.
It's as I said earlier, I think I'm going to be making a lot of notes while I edit this. So I apologize for my lengthy pauses. This next one was not something you wrote, but something that you quoted, which was the following. You met someone on the road on a motorcycle. I think it might have been a BMW. I don't know why I remember that detail, but and he said, most of the stuff we carry on our motorcycles is to keep us warm and dry. And that, in the context of your story, that sounded almost monastic to me. Is that what made you remember it? Is that what made that comment worth recording in your story? And do you have reflections on that now?
Yeah, I was in Yellowstone National Park, and I wanted to see the guys there. I wanted to see Old Faithful, so I stayed at that hotel, which was old part and new part. And for some reason, they always want to stick me in the old part because they think I'd like it more. But I live in a meditation center that the houses were built in like 1905, so I sort of like new stuff too. And I was in the parking lot, and this other motorcycle guy pulls in, and we struck up a conversation, and somehow it got around. The conversation got around to that, that everything is just to stay, warm and dry. And I'm going, man, that is just so true, and it really talks about the getting used to suffering and being free. That you can't be free until you just don't want to be warm and dry, and so I thought, yeah, because most of the stuff I carried with me was jackets and sweaters and a rain suit and a helmet and boots and all those things to keep me as comfortable as possible on the open road. And again, now at the tender age of 71, and the idea of suffering, that oftentimes there comes a time when we can't run away from the suffering. The body hurts, or the mind's a little dull, or, the food doesn't taste as good as it used to, and blah, 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 on and on and on. So it leads me to look at all that experience on the road as preparing me for old age in a certain kind of way, that 20 years later, I don't have to be on the road to suffer. All I have to do is get up in the morning, and there you go. That's it. So how can I come to a place of acceptance with that and understand that it's not something against me? It's not just because I'm who I am. It's simply because that's what life does to you. Life brings you into the world, and life takes you out. And then in between the birth and the death, there's like a lot of suffering. And that's very much a Buddhist perspective. But you don't have to accept the suffering. There are things we can do, meditation, practice of precepts, things of that sort, that allow us to live and not suffer, but simply to live and be old.
So you've possibly answered the next question, but I'm dying to ask it anyway. And this is the last passage that I wanted to quote from your story of that trip, and it's this: as it turns out, the truth found in the Dharma and the truth you find on the road is pretty much the same thing. That was kind of exciting to me as a thought. Can you talk a bit more about that? And is there a way to articulate that truth, or do we all have to go and find it for ourselves?
Well, no, there is a way to articulate it, because the Buddha 2,600 years ago talked about it, and he talked about life is suffering. That's the first noble truth, that ultimately everything becomes unsatisfactory. Even the most pleasant ride becomes ultimately unpleasant and unsatisfactory. And the reason for that is desire. Desire pushes us into wanting the good or getting rid of the bad. So we have, ultimately, life is unsatisfactory, according to Buddhism. The reason is our desire. Third, thankfully, he didn't stop there, and he said that there is an answer, and the answer is nirvana. Now, nirvana can simply mean the end of suffering while you're alive. That not the end of pain. Pain is just part of life, but you don't have to suffer with the pain. And finally, the Noble Eightfold Path, which leads to the end of suffering. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Those 8 path factors allow us to experience life and have far less suffering. And so as I'm on the road, those thoughts kept running through my head in the rest areas. And I'm thinking, yeah, the Dharma, what the teachings of the Buddha, or ultimate truth, however one wants to take that, really can be experienced on the road on a motorcycle. In a car, less so, because there are too many ways not to feel the suffering in a car. I always am amazed. The heated seat, cooled seat, stereo that cost $5,000. It goes on and on and on. and then you sit on this sort of two-wheeled, piece of metal with plastic, and you go, wow, okay, what's going to keep me comfortable on this? How am I going to not suffer on this? And the more you ride, the more you understand the truth of riding, the less suffering you experience. And I found that parallel with living a life as a Buddhist and riding a motorcycle.
It's interesting. You created echoes for me there of people I've talked to who've done extremely long and arduous trips. There was a woman I interviewed about a year and a half ago who had taken her daughter from London to Cape Town in a sidecar rig, and her daughter was autistic, and the goal of the trip was to sort of teach her courage. And she made the point a few times in our interview that you have to put yourself in a position where there's kind of no way out. The episode was called "Burning the Ship," so it gives you an idea of kind of what that was about. And I wonder what this says about the need to push our boundaries as motorcyclists, what you call breaking the chains of your comfort zone. There are some riders who make a point of pushing all the time in some way or another. And others, probably me among them, that are, a bit complacent in their happiness, if I can put it that way. Is there an imperative here to keep making ourselves uncomfortable, in your view, as riders? I mean, I suppose I probably know what the answer is philosophically, but I wonder whether you think if we're going to call motorcycling a meditative experience, whether that includes a duty to keep pushing. And I apologize for the long question, but does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, I don't think we're pushing ourselves to suffer. The suffering just happens. And a parallel that I found was about halfway to Wisconsin, and so at that point I figured I'm committed. It would take just as long to go back as to go ahead. And so there I was. I couldn't, not do it anymore. I had to continue. And that being in that place, allows you to learn a lot because you can't stop. Now, there was a time in my meditation practice when, after a weekend retreat, I thought about, you know what? I'm screwed. I can never go back to being who I used to be because I've experienced too much of this now. And I can't forget it. And I'm just going to have to keep putting one foot in front of the other and walk ahead. So when I was younger, I thought, well, if I don't like it, I can always not do it. And there comes a point in your life where you've done it so much that you can't jump out anymore and say, no, I'm not going to. You have to go forward rather than go backward. And that long motorcycle ride put me in the place of going, yeah, I can't go back. I just have to go forward. And so there's sort of a surrender then to that process of going forward, but not to suffer. The idea is not to suffer. The idea is to get to your destination. But between now and the destination, there will be suffering. And that's the nature of being human. And how can I deal with that? And if I can figure out a way to deal with that on the motorcycle, can I use that in my life? And it turns out you can.
Yeah, that's clear. Now, you mentioned the word destination. I realize on that ride, your physical destination was Wisconsin, but I wonder if there's a metaphysical destination, or if we're all pointed at something when we're having that experience. Is there, even as I frame the question, it sounds like a first-year philosophy student, but I shall press on. If we're aware of the experience we're having and there's a purpose to it beyond just covering geography, what do you think that destination is?
Well, exactly, and we get confused by that because we think the journey is the destination, and actually it's just the journey. When I got to Wisconsin, when I finally made my destination, it was nothing like I imagined it would be. And every destination I've ever succeeded in attaining has never been how I thought it was going to be. And so on the road, the destination became just to find a place to stay that night. That was my most immediate destination. And then even before that is, where's the next gas station so I can get some gas? And even before that, where's the rest stop with the bathroom so I can use that? So there were a lot of destinations on the road, and each destination led to the next. And then all those destinations put together turns out to be the journey. So it's really not about going anyplace. It's just about doing it.
Yes, of course it is. That's a good answer. I wonder what you think of this. I've spoken to, as I mentioned earlier, I've spoken to lots of people who've undertaken what were for them epic journeys. Probably the most recent one was a young English man who was the youngest person ever to circumnavigate the globe on his own. That was obviously a dramatic example, but there've been plenty, and it's a big part of, as you know, of motorcycling culture, this idea. And these people seem to fall for me into one of two groups, the ones who are either searching for something or the ones who are trying to let go of something. And I wonder what you think of that as a taxonomy, and whether you would put that trip that we've been talking about that you took into one of those categories. Is that have I oversimplified?
No, that's a good way to put it. And I think there are a lot of people searching, and there's many ways to search, many roads, many paths of searching. And sometimes it's a well-defined answer that you're looking for. And sometimes you're not quite sure what the answer is, but you sort of worked on the question. And so you're searching. And then I've often thought, though, it's not so much the searching that drove me to the motorcycle, but it's what I found. I found something on the motorcycle that I couldn't find anyplace else. And that was the autonomy of separateness. Paradoxically, that autonomy and that separateness turned into fullness and interconnectedness. And so we have the dance of the relative and the ultimate. And I found that simply going to the store became an epic journey. That it was, will I make it there? Will I have, is my backpack big enough to carry all the groceries back to my apartment? All these things. So it was never just get in the car and go to the store. It was always, every time I hit that motorcycle, it was the epic journey. And then when I turned 52 and wanted to see if I still had it, the epic journey became, how much life is left in me? Can I do it? Can I be flexible? Can I be aware? Can I, do all the things that I'm supposed to do and make it a complete success? And so for me, the epic journey is just where I'm going and what I'm doing today. And then what do you find? And you find what you already knew. At some level, you already knew what you were going to find, what the search was all about. It's just, you just needed to wake up to it. And that the motorcycle ride helped me to wake up.
I wonder if the idea of a road has some significance in Buddhism. There's an expression, I think, that begins, if you meet the Buddha on the road, and I won't even, I'm sure you've heard it a million times, but actually the most interesting part of that sentence to me is this idea of the road. There's a presumption of travel in there, in that thought. I wonder, does the road have a special meaning in Buddhist thought, and is our road the road?
Well, the Eightfold Path, it's a path. And the book that you alluded to was If You See the Buddha on the Road, Kill Him, which was a famous book for a while. I think it was the 70s it came out, if I'm not mistaken, maybe earlier. I never really understood the title until somebody explained it to me. And they said, well, the title of that book means this: if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. If you see the Buddha on the road, it's just a concept. And that concept is going to prevent you from seeing the Buddha. Now, the Buddha, again, is just a concept. So you have to get past all these concepts in order to have a direct teaching, a direct seeing, a direct hearing, a sense door experience, not filtered through mind or thought or intellect or prejudice or self. Can you do that? And so the path leads you to that place. And I found the journey on the motorcycle led me to that place, that there was no intellectual constructs that were stronger than the experience of being on the road, that they wiped them all away. And it became this direct experience, and it became something that's hard to talk about. And when you do talk about it, it turns out to be more poetry than anything else, more poetry than prose. And sometimes it can lead to sort of not making much sense at all because it's so abstract. And you're trying to make it linear, and it's not. It's just a present moment experience. So we don't want to get caught up in the concepts. That's what that title of the book, don't get caught in the concept. Get caught in the experience behind the concept. That's what we're seeking. And that will give us the greatest amount of knowing rather than understanding. I make a distinction between understanding and knowing, understanding being intellectual and knowing being intuitive. And for most of us, our intuition has atrophied because we don't get a chance to use it that much anymore. We're always thinking about stuff. And so the road forced me into my intuition and out of my understanding. And then there was a certain knowing that comes that can't be expressed, but can be experienced.
Reading the story of that trip, and especially this idea of the sort of breaking of chains, I was struck by how much you sounded to my ears like a fellow motorcyclist, an articulate fellow motorcyclist, but a fellow motorcyclist. I didn't feel as if the trip was being, retold as a parable in any obvious way. And it made me wonder, while you were still riding, how did motorcycling coexist with your practice? I suppose we've probably touched on that to some extent already, but as I said, I read that story and I heard one of us in a sense. I did not hear a lesson being taught. How do you feel? How did those two things work together?
Well, what comes to mind is the idea of being a motorcyclist, number one. And I didn't necessarily look like a motorcyclist. I never felt that I looked like one. And when I would pull in and get some gas or some other motorcyclists be hanging out, I wasn't immediately accepted. I just didn't look like they did. And I wasn't riding a motorcycle like they are. And I wasn't, and I'm going, okay, so what does it mean to be me and a motorcyclist? And what can I learn from that? And it's just sort of that role playing that allowed me to feel a certain way. I felt a certain inner strength, when I related to my motorcycle and the way I rode it. I enjoyed the way it looked. I thought it was a beautiful machine, and I enjoyed the complexity and yet the simplicity at the same time. There was so much going on that I just it's hard to put into words that feeling of, I was a motorcyclist. I felt that I was. And I expressed it, as you say, Bruce, as a motorcyclist. And yet, if you were to look at me and see what I do for a living, you'd go, no, he's not a motorcyclist. And so the big question is, what is a motorcyclist? And is there room for everybody? And the conclusion I came to was, there's plenty of room for everybody. All you need is a motorcycle, either a 125cc Honda, or a 1000cc, Harley, whatever you ride. That's the deal. That's where you are. And so that came out of that. I hope that was the answer to the question you were looking for. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. It does sort of make me wonder. This is going to seem like a bit of an unfair question, but you've spoken at a number of points in this conversation about suffering and about what the utility of suffering is. And yet suffering is largely the reason why you gave up riding, it sounds like. Now, I appreciate that may have been a pragmatic decision, but I wonder, in the context of everything we've just talked about, to what extent was there a natural ending to that? Because there were surely ways to keep going, but you didn't.
Yeah. Let me tell you the ending. Let me tell you how it all came about. I wanted to sort of fix up my motorcycle, and I bought some new tires, and I took it to a Hollywood motorcycle dealership and said, "Hey, can you put these tires on and can you adjust the valves and change the oil and do all the stuff that make it really nice and all that kind of stuff." So I took it in, and then a couple weeks later, I got a phone call saying, we run into a problem, and so we're going to need some more time. And then a couple weeks later, I got another phone call saying, we ran into some more problems, and I'm going to need some more time. So they had the motorcycle in there for 2 months, and when I finally picked it up, I thanked everybody for their consideration and a job well done. But the darn thing never worked right after that. It was there was problems with it would flood, and it couldn't go any faster than 70 and all the other stuff. And I said to myself, well, do you want to take it back? Because apparently they messed it up and don't know how to fix it, or should I take it to another dealer and have them fix it? Or is this a sign? Is this a sign that maybe it's time for me to end my motorcycle riding? That the universe is saying, Kusala, you had a great run, 20 plus years, no accidents, you experienced so much, you learned so much, but this might be, the time. So I parked it in back of the meditation center and didn't touch it for a couple more months, and not really sure what I would take it in and get it fixed or just leave it, and I had to let all the, pain and suffering go of not having the motorcycle, and cursing the ones who messed it up and couldn't fix it and all that. I had to let all that go. And so I finally let it all go. And I said, you know what? Maybe it is time. Maybe it is time. So I called NPR and said, I've got a motorcycle that I want to donate. And they came and picked it up and gave me a donation receipt that I could use as a tax deduction, and off it went. So the reason I quit motorcycle riding wasn't because suffering, wasn't necessarily because I was old and gray, but it was more like there was a sign that perhaps was trying to get my attention, that now's the time to let go. Now's the time to let go. So that's the real story of why I'm no longer riding. And it's fine. I was able to let go of all of that.
Well, I suppose you'd be uniquely well equipped to do that. But I in a sense, that story is about autonomy. It was sort of a final act of autonomy with respect to motorcycling. There's a lovely phrase that I heard from the author Melissa Holbrook Pearson. She used the phrase "riding towards the end," and there was just a sort of sweetness about the idea that if you're lucky, you'll be able to choose, and that there's some comfort in being the one who chose. At least that's how I hear it. Because I'm not terribly far behind you, and that day will come. And hearing you, I kind of hope it's up to me. Does that resonate for you?
I think I did choose to let it go, and I think that was the perfect ending, rather than an accident and I'm in the hospital and the motorcycle's wrecked. I had a friend that was a motorcycle rider and ended up in the hospital because of an accident. So I chose that this was the time, but I chose not because I wanted to let it go, but I chose that this might be a sign to let it go. And could I understand it? And could I do it in a skillful way? And not feel, the separation anxiety, or the feeling is not fair, or I had a couple good years of riding to go and now I can't, and all those reasons why you beat yourself up. It was a perfect time to close the book and say, okay, now I've got this, and I've got the beginning, and I've got the middle, and I've got the end, and that feels good. What's next?
Yeah, which is where you, I mean, that's the best place you could possibly be in this life at that moment, I think, is to be able to say what's next. So you do a lot of public speaking, I know, and you've been a prison chaplain and a police chaplain, and of course your work with the meditation center. I think most of the world gets to know you as a Buddhist monk, and are then surprised to learn that you ride a motorcycle and that you play the blues harmonica, which I love the moment when you said, what other kind of music would a Buddhist play? I thought that was brilliant. But I know that for a lot of those engagements, while you were still riding, you would roll up on your bike. You would appear at the venue on two wheels. And I wondered, so obviously the main reason for that is because that was your principal form of transportation. But I wondered if you were also making a point, or if there was some value in the element of surprise. Was there some premeditation in that? If you'll forgive the pun, in that choice?
Well, you're right about the choice. The choice was that was my only form of transportation. So I oftentimes, sometimes people pick you up and take you to the event. Oftentimes they don't. You have to get there yourself. So that was my only form of transportation. But it always raised an eyebrow. And people were always wondering, well, why are you riding a motorcycle? And my answer was, I can't afford a car. And somehow they sort of accepted that. And in Asian countries, oftentimes you'll see, people riding motorcycles or scooters or, all the time. So it wasn't such a big jump in my mind, but it was for other people. And I think it sort of, it signaled something. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Robert Pirsig, that a book I've read 3 times now and enjoyed each time. That there's some kind of message in that there's a certain level of freedom on a motorcycle that you don't have in a car. There's a certain amount of freedom in life that you have if you only have a motorcycle, but there's an accountability and the determination that's necessary to ride in the rain to get to your destination, even if you don't want to. And so there was like a lot of stuff going on when I pulled into the parking lots of the people that invited me to speak. And then when I stopped riding, and pretty much just, did the car thing, people would always ask, where's your motorcycle? How's the motorcycle? They were so fond of that image of me on the motorcycle that they had a hard time letting that go. and which is fine. I think it set up something in their mind that maybe one day they'll have a motorcycle too, and they'll get that experience.
Yeah, it's also a pretty powerful symbol for people. I wouldn't presume to decode it entirely, but there's something, there's just something about making the choice, or what people perceive to be the choice of being on a motorcycle, that sends a pretty strong cultural message, whether they aspire to it or not, which I guess was behind my question. You mentioned Pirsig's book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I was going to ask you about that in a minute, but let's talk about it now. You obviously liked it because you've ridden it several times. Can you tell me what you liked about it, and how would you summarize the thesis? Because there's hardly been a more parsed piece of popular literature that I can think of. I'm dying to know what you thought it was all about.
Yeah, well, about a lot of things, and of course, and the main thing I got out of it was relationship. That relationship is really important. And so we have the relationship between Robert Pirsig, the author, and his son, Chris. We have his friends that rode the BMW who never did anything as far as maintenance goes because it was far too complicated. And of course, Robert would break down the motorcycle and fix this and fix that and felt comfortable. Then you had, the journey itself and all the thoughts that come. And then the thoughts that don't come as well. It took me, I found a book called, I'm going to paraphrase, Understanding Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. 2 guys wrote a book on how to understand the book. And the part that always messed me up was Western philosophy. I didn't know as much then as I do now, and so that was hard to follow. The part on Eastern philosophy was a little easier for me to follow because I found that to be more interesting. The relationship of the motorcycle and to Robert and how he wrote about being on the road and how he wrote about experiencing things. And then finally making it to California and seeing the ocean, and the journey had ended. And yet it hadn't. The journey hadn't ended. It was still, that was just one of the destinations along the way of his life. The sad part for me, years later, was reading about Chris, his son, who was in San Francisco at the Zen Center and doing meditation. And after one of the meditations, he walked outside and was going to walk home, and somebody approached him and wanted to steal some money from him. And he said, "I don't have any money." And the guy stabbed him, and he ended up dying from the stab wound. And I thought to myself, wow, man, that's not the way it's supposed to end. Come on. And yet that's the way it ended. And so you just look at this journey that he was on, and it had so many examples of just life and what he didn't expect and what he did expect that didn't happen and all those other things. And after reading about the history of the book, it was he went to 20 different publishers. Nobody wanted it. It wasn't going to sell. And then that one publisher said, "I'll give it a shot." And it was a bestseller. And I can remember back in the 70s walking in Westwood Village, which is in Los Angeles, and looking in the window of a bookstore when they had bookstores, and there was Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Now, that was way before my meditation and my Zen and my Buddhism period. And I thought to myself, I wonder what the hell that's all about, because I had no clue. And years later, I picked it up and started to read it. And it took me a long time to read it the first time. And then I got the audiobook and on CD when CDs were popular. And I would take, if I was traveling to a conference or a meditation retreat that was a distance away, I'd take the little CDs along with me, listen to them on the road. And I thought to myself, this is the perfect thing to listen to on the road, going to wherever I was going to go. It just sucked me in and made me go right back to that experience of reading the book. And so I can't really give you a good, definite answer on what it's all about, except it's relationship and life.
Yeah. Well, then maybe the fact that it's a bit of a Rorschach is its strength. Did you identify with either side of the ideological divide that was proposed there? This idea of I'm trying to remember now, the classicists versus the romantics. Did you connect with that at all?
No, I hate to say it, but I didn't. I've never been one to relate to, prototypes or ideological, arguments, or which side are you on? Are you this or you that? I've never been smart enough to pick a side.
That's very kind of you. I usually find picking a side is an excuse to avoid thinking, but maybe I've got a longer journey ahead of me than you. Speaking of, I watched a wonderful talk that you gave about karma, which was in several chapters. So I won't bother trying to summarize anything here, but what it really means in Buddhism versus what the rest of us think it means. And it kind of spoke to me as a motorcyclist because it really drove home again and again this idea that it's all on us. This idea of sort of the thoughts, the words, the deeds, the responsibility for consequence. That really, karma, as I understood your explanation of it, felt a lot like a sort of spiritual engine for being a great motorcyclist, if you like. How would you briefly, and I appreciate that's unfair, how would you briefly explain karma to the people listening to this?
Okay, it's a big subject, but to keep it simple, karma is everything you think, say, and do. Vipaka, which is a Pali word, is the consequence. So karma is what you do. Vipaka is the consequence of what you do. think or say. Karma is one of the contributing factors, but not the only one, that to everything that happens in your life. Karma is one of the contributing factors, but not the only one. So we find ourselves in certain circumstances. For instance, if it's raining, okay, and you're on the road, that's not your karma. That's the rain. and your karma is to think, say, and do something skillful, not to slide out and end up on the ground. And so there's a lot of circumstances we find ourselves in that are there not because of anything we've done, not because of any consequences of anything we've done, but simply because we live on Earth, we have gravity, we have a mind that thinks a certain way. But our karma, what we think, say, and do, allows us to have some say in the matter of our life. And I think that's what I really enjoy, that the fact that, yeah, I got something to say about this. I've got something to do about this. I don't have to believe in fate. I don't have to say that it was predestined to happen, because it wasn't. There's nothing predestined to happen if you understand karma. And even if you really screw up and do something stupid, and you know that karmic consequences are going to be very painful before the consequences occur, rarely it's not instant karma. Rarely it's, there's karma and vipaka, and there's a time in between. All you need to do to change the consequences is do something better before the consequences occur. To be kinder, to be more generous, to be more observant of other people and respectful of them. All those things we can do, and that lessens the karmic consequences of anything we've done in the past. So I like that. Always got something to do. We always need to be proactive, and there's an accountability and being in charge that gives me confidence in my future.
Well said. Although I'll still suggest people listen to the videos. But that perfectly captures, I think, the parallel that I was talking about. You tell a funny story about receiving your Buddhist name, Kusala, which, if I remember correctly, means skillful. And apparently you were given this name not because you were, but because you weren't. And it was sort of a reminder of what you need to work on. And I hope that's a fair summary. I thought it was brilliant because it embedded this idea of humility into who you are. And I really connected with that because I always thought humility was the best piece of safety equipment a rider can have. So am I extracting something from that correctly? And what do you think about that? Talk a bit about the role of humility in all this.
Yeah, that story is one of my favorites, and it's about getting my name, Kusala, and when I became an official Buddhist. So it's not when I was a monk, but when I became an official Buddhist. I wanted to be a Buddhist. I wanted to identify myself as a Buddhist, and so we have a ceremony that we do. And we take the 5 precepts. I will practice not to take life. I will practice not to take what is not given. I will practice not to indulge in sexual misconduct. I will practice not to speak unskillfully. And I will practice not to consume intoxicants. So these are the practice precepts that every Buddhist takes when they become an official Buddhist, and you get a certificate, and then you're given a Buddhist name. And so my Buddhist name was Kusala, which means skillful. And I was very excited that they recognized that in me. And then they said, we're giving you the name Kusala because you aren't, not because you are. And I'm going, wow, okay, so what does that mean? What they're saying is this is something you can be, even though you're not now. You've got this as potential, and you can realize it, and all you need to do is practice the 5 precepts. And the 5 precepts will allow you to be skillful. I'm going, okay, but how about meditation? How about all those books on Buddhism? How about all that stuff? Isn't that going to make me skillful? And the answer that I got back was, well, yes, it will, but being mindful of those 5 precepts in every moment of every day will allow you to go forward at a much faster rate, because you are going to have a complete day of practice every day of your life, practicing not to take life, practicing this, practicing that. So I'm going, okay. So I kept reading the books. I kept listening to Dharma talks. I kept doing all that stuff. But every time I was partially broke the precept, or maybe broke the precept, for instance, not to kill, and there's a fly, and you kill the fly. And you go, whoa, man, I took that precept not to kill, and I killed the fly, and I wasn't even thinking about it, because that was simply a reaction and not a response, and da-da-da-da. Would there be some way I could not kill the fly and remove it from my immediate environment? And of course there is. You catch the fly and you take it outside, and then it's not a problem, and you don't have to kill it. So you start looking around at life, and all the times you've taken a life needlessly, whether it be a mosquito or a cockroach or fly, and there's oftentimes a workaround that you can get rid of the problem but not having to kill it. And so, okay, so the precepts and having the name Kusala, being skillful, has really motivated me in a very specific way to look at life so much differently than I did before. And I found this little Buddhist ceremony of becoming an official Buddhist was remarkable in the impact it had on my life.
Yeah, remarkable. Indeed. So the last episode of this podcast, I sort of culturally appropriated the concept of the beginner mind. And I wonder if that's a little bit, if that connects somehow with what you're saying.
Well, maybe. I've looked at beginner's mind a little differently than that. So you take your 5 precepts, you get your Buddhist name, you read all these books, you go to all these Dharma talks, you do the retreats, you meditate every day, you do blah blah blah, and now you're getting to be pretty skillful and pretty professional at being a Buddhist. But what that does is that doesn't allow you to see stuff. It doesn't allow you to see anything but what it means to be a professional Buddhist. So the idea with beginner's mind, Suzuki Roshi wrote the book. It's wonderful. And Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, I think that's the title, is that every day needs to be your first day. That this is the first time you've ever experienced this day. And the hard part is it just seems like another day. But it's not. It's a very unique day. It's the only day that we'll ever have that's like this. And every day is like that. So to come to beginner's mind is to look at your life with fresh eyes, to look at the world in a fresh, new way, to be excited about the possibility of living in this day and having it be something you've never experienced before. And there's a certain energy that comes out of that perspective.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Earlier, we talked about your path as having, in part, sort of been a way of overcoming the fear of death, and I think at least in the beginning, and I think there are a lot of motorcyclists who feel the same way about the communion that they have with their machines. That it's a way of. There are very few riders who get on a bike completely fearlessly and don't go home in an ambulance. I think there's some kind of process going on there that seems similar to the one that you experienced. I wonder if there's anything. So if we accept that's true, if you accept that's true, I wonder what we can learn from your journey about dealing with that fear.
We're dealing with the fear of death. Yeah, it's a tough one because if you think about the angels and the gods, small g-s, they never have to die. Animals in the world, ourselves included, well, no, not ourselves, but the animals in the world, like the cats and dogs and fish, and they don't know they're going to die. And we're the only animal that knows we're going to die, and there's nothing we can do about it. So we're in a really unique position to look at the world and say, okay, I know I have to die, and I don't want to. So how can I practice How can I practice dying in an everyday situation? And so I started with looking at my meditation practice as allowing myself, capital S, S-E-L-F, to die into the moment, to die into the practice of meditation, to not have a past and future, to not be identified in a particular way, to get to that place of interconnection and interdependence. And then as the gong rings and the meditation is over, I reconstitute. I'm reborn, if you will. And so now the next person takes over until the next meditation. And then that person dies into the moment and then is reborn because of the gong and having to move and continue life. And then another person and another person. So practicing meditation allows us to die into the moment and be reborn. Buddhism does have something called rebirth. But then I thought to myself on a bigger level, well, how many different people have I been in this single lifetime? I've been the adolescent, I've been the teenager, I've been the 20s guy, the 30s guy, the 40s guy. And were they all the same guy? Well, no. In order for the next guy to happen, the old guy had to die. And so metaphorically or poetically, you die into the moment, you die into the day, you die into the generation, and the next person is reborn. So life becomes similar to a relay race. We just keep handing off the baton to the next person we're going to be. And ultimately, in Buddhism, then that last person dies, and then the new person is reborn. So what's a good way for a Buddhist to die? Well, a good way for the Buddhist to die is to turn off the TV, number one, and not to think about all the stuff you've done or been, or think about the new life you're looking forward to and what you're going to do and what you're going to be and how it's going to be. And so turning away from family and friends, from career, from place, and turning towards the new rebirth. So there's a whole process simply in the meditation, simply in a generation, simply every day. And I remember when I quit smoking, I smoked for 14 years. And when I turned 28, and that was the beginning of my spiritual quest to get physically fit and mentally competent. And I just quit one day. I woke up one day and said, I'm going to die. I am mortal. And the reason I stopped smoking was not so I would live longer, but I would have a better quality of life while I'm still alive. Then I realized that I had to kill the person who smoked. So the person who didn't smoke could be reborn and born into this lifetime. So it took a long time to kill the person that didn't smoke and form or give birth to the person that was never have another cigarette. And then every now and then that person that used to smoke comes and visits. Even after all these years, I quit in 1978. And after all these years, there'll be a little desire to have a cigarette. But it goes by quickly. It's not a long desire. It's a very quick desire. But I'm thinking that person never really dies completely. They're always in the background. So all those people I have been in this lifetime are still there at some level in some way. And oftentimes I'll see myself responding or reacting to a situation in a way that I used to do 20 years ago. And I would go, my, isn't that something? That's still not gone. So I find this idea of death, the ultimate death of this lifetime, to be simply a series of mini deaths while we're still alive.
Well, that's considerably more uplifting than the way I was looking at it. That's fantastic. And so I'm wondering, do you think, quite separate from the purely spiritual, implications of this, do you think motorcyclists would benefit from meditation? Is that something, is Leon's assertion that these two things can help each other ultimately, in fact, accurate?
Well, I think the motorcyclists are already meditating. They just don't have a name for it. And I think trying to attach a label to what they're doing on the motorcycle is taking away some of the some of the natural ability. So I would say a person who meditates would find it similar to riding a motorcycle, and it might enhance the motorcycle riding. But I think most motorcyclists already do that and just don't have a name for it.
Yep, that's what I would say too. I was hoping that would be your answer. Reverend Kusala, it has been such a delight to share this time with you. I feel like I could keep you all day. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
Well, thanks for the invitation to speak, and I've enjoyed my time with you, and it's so fun now to reflect on my motorcycle riding. That it's such an important place in my life, and it gives me great joy just to even talk about it.
Oh, how wonderful. Well, I hope somehow there's one more transformational trip in your future, but I'm thrilled to hear that, and I think everybody listening to this will be too. So whatever you're riding, be safe out there, and thanks again.
Well, thank you, and be safe and be well.
Well, I really did make notes while I was editing this. A page of scribbled quotes, and here are a few. The drone of the engine was like a knife cutting my thoughts into little pieces. That's just amazing to me. The cocoon of awareness, the autonomy of separateness, the dance of the relative and the ultimate, and the idea of dying into the moment. And I quickly realized that this isn't going to be one of those episodes that I can wrap up in a tidy bow. As far as the original question goes, is riding a motorcycle like meditating? Well, the answer is obviously, and yet still somehow surprisingly, yes. In fact, what this conversation left me wondering was not whether riding is like meditating, but whether I'm expecting enough of myself when I'm doing it. I was kind of gobsmacked by this idea of every ride being like a life in miniature, where we relive the moment of birth and the act of living, and finally a kind of death when it's all over, only to be reborn the next time we thumb the starter. If you're anything like me, that rang thunderingly true. Well, those aren't words we'd use to describe the experience to a normal person, but that really is how it feels. And if every ride is a life in miniature, then shouldn't our hearts soar every time that engine starts? Shouldn't we be wide awake for every moment? And shouldn't we be grateful and at peace when it's all over? Every time, without taking a single second for granted? And if all that's true, then shouldn't chasing that experience become a practice? Shouldn't we strive to be, in some sense, skillful monks? Well, this is one of those episodes I'm going to listen to again, and maybe again. And maybe eventually, if I listen hard enough over the sound of the engine and the wind, I'll hear those words too. Welcome back to the universe. Well, thanks for listening. You'll find show notes for this episode at thismotorcyclelife.com. That's also how you can reach me if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions. Emailing me at thismotorcyclelife@gmail.com works too, and I look forward to answering every one. I'm a bit quiet on Instagram these days as the winter closes in, but you can still find me lurking there if you want to say hi. And that's also where you'll find a lot of the people I've interviewed for this podcast, including Venerable Kusala Bhikshu. Well, this episode's playlist recommendation comes from a listener and a friend of the podcast, Kyler Morrison, whose music I've used once before. Kyler wrote me back in September to say he'd headed west from his home in Ohio to make a new life in Arizona, and had recorded a couple of new tracks to celebrate this new chapter. The one I'm going to share with you now is called Ready Boy, and it just happens to be about finding rebirth on the road. It's kind of a sign from the universe. Buy it or stream it wherever you like to get your music, and in the meantime, keep staying alive out there.
Crashing waves roll on immensely. The ocean's romance always gets me. Come home, you're ready, boy. Come home, you're ready, boy. But that southwest desert sure looks pretty. The clear blue sky, it whispers to me. Come home, you're ready, boy. Come home, you're ready, boy. I hear what you say and I am listening. I know what to do and that you love me. My God, last year was a mess.